Do you remember Wali? Wali, the Canadian elite sniper, all of the hype about him going to Ukraine to go fight against Russia. Do you remember that? Well, it turns out he's back in Canada right now. And I bet you didn't hear about that, because why would the Western media want to tell you that he's back in Canada? And not just that, but the story he has to tell is a very, very disappointing story for everyone out there who thinks Ukraine is winning and that the West is doing anything at all to change the tide of this war. When I do my videos, I check the comment sections. I try to read all of the comments and all of the emails and messages people send me, and I would say the vast majority are very positive. But every once in a while, you'll get someone who says Putin propaganda, Russian propaganda, even though my updates on Ukraine are almost always me just reading Pentagon briefings. But maybe they don't like my interpretation of them. But in this case, I'm going to take entirely Western articles featuring Wali and a few other people he was connected to while in Ukraine. And I'm going to tell you what's going on in Ukraine based on what they said. Not my interpretation, but based on what they said. And I want to start with this article here. Under a foreign flag, Canadian veterans explain why they're fighting for Ukraine. They say in Afghanistan, he was nicknamed Wali, and the name stuck for the former sniper with the Royal 22nd Regiment who earlier this week, in the dead of night, crossed the border into Ukraine from Poland, answering a call from Ukraine's president for a foreign legion to help repel the Russian invasion. The article also said, since crossing into Ukraine, he and other veterans have taken shelter in partially renovated homes. They are going through the final steps of linking up with Ukrainian authorities who want to place them with the Army's territorial battalions and recently reorganized reserve unit of citizen soldiers, a force the country had hoped eventually to build up to 10,000 officers and 120,000 volunteers. Well, that is definitely not going to happen. And these pie-in-the-sky ideas remind me of the situation in Syria, how the US said they were going to stand up this massive free Syrian army. They were going to build it up in Jordan and then send it over to the border. Never happened because it defies reality. That's not how building an army works. The CBC also mentioned this thing called the Norman Group, and they claimed that it had volunteered to deliver aid and assistance in the eastern portion of Ukraine, where Russia has fought an 8-year proxy war against the pro-Western government in Kiev. And I will talk more about the Norman Group, which is now known as the Norman Brigade. I will talk about them in just a minute. So Wali goes to Ukraine. And let's be honest, everything around Wali going to Ukraine was Western propaganda. It was war propaganda, and it was meant to attract other people to go fight in Ukraine. And it was also to boost the image and the morale of Ukraine and this war that they're fighting. Then there was this. This is from ABC Australia. Former Canadian Forces sniper Wali debunks Russian disinformation campaign that claims he died in Ukraine. And they said it was a rumor spread on Russia's social media that a Canadian sniper had died in battle in Ukraine and had been debunked by the man himself, proving he is very much alive. Now, they're calling it a Russian disinformation campaign, but it was just a rumor spreading around on social media, just like all of the rumors spreading around about, you know, what a super soldier Wali was. And to be fair, a lot of the mainstream media organizations in the West never repeated those claims, but they were on, I would say, less reputable Western outlets. And they were also all over social media. So I would not call this a Russian disinformation campaign. Unless you saw it on TASS or RT, I would say that it wasn't a Russian disinformation campaign. It was just rumors spreading on social media, as rumors often do. And ABC even kind of gets into that. They say misinformation about the former Canadian Armed Forces member, who is known by the name Wali to protect the identity of his family, has been circulating online for weeks. The rumors include claims that Wali was the deadliest sniper in the world and held the record for the longest distance kill shot, none of which is true. ABC also notes that this rumor was spreading around on VK, which is Russia's version of Facebook. They said that he was killed in Mariupol. That wasn't true. Behind Wali, his whole story, and you will see in just a moment, I think the truth is actually much more damning than these rumors that were spreading around about him. Now, let's get into that. There's this article here. This is from CBC. This is Canadian news. Shadows War, a Canadian veteran describes weeks under fire in Ukraine. And they've got videos of him throughout this article. So let's go into that. They start out by talking about the last patrol Shadow was on, which is why he's no longer on the front line. Now he's in Lvov. He says he's going to continue doing humanitarian work there from now on. He's done fighting. It says, about 10 days ago, a Russian tank, this article's from May 6th. About 10 days ago, from May 6th, a Russian tank, that Shadow, and a fellow Canadian, the sniper known as Wali, had been quietly stalking in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, turned and fired on them. 2 Ukrainian soldiers who were with them had ignored Wali's advice a moment before by stepping outside the cover of their observation post, nothing more than a trench, for a cigarette. Shadow, a former Canadian soldier from Sherbrooke, a member of the Royal 22nd Regiment who later served as a meteorological technician with the Navy, had been about to join his Ukrainian friends when the tank opened up, landing a shell right between the 2 Ukrainians. Shadow was blown back to the trench, his ears ringing from the explosion. He crawled up, poked his head outside, and was greeted by a scene of utter carnage. One of the men had died instantly. The second Ukrainian soldier was still alive, but barely. And then this is a quote. He was like just a couple of feet from me and still breathing, but no legs, Shadow told CBC News Thursday in an interview in Lviv in western Ukraine. And then we made eye contact. I looked at him. He looked at me. It took a couple of moments for the soldier to die. And then the CBC also says Wali, a fellow Vandu and sniper with combat experience in Afghanistan, was maneuvering around to get a clean shot at one of the Russian iron monsters with an American-made Javelin anti-armor missile. The tank had been tantalizingly out of reach before it turned on them and struck. So this guy, Shadow, he noted in the interview, the video interview, that the Russian tank fire was extremely precise. Here's the thing. This is not Iraq 2003, where the Iraqis were using old export versions of Soviet tanks. These are newer tanks. Even if they're the T-72s, most of them have infrared sights on them. They have computerized fire control, modern fire control. And yes, they can see you day or night, and they can hit you very precisely. And this is what they're going up against. When the Western media says that the Russians are incompetent, they're bungling, they can't do even the most basic military operation, that's war propaganda. Shadow here is telling you that they can't even get in range with a javelin, and these things are picking them off with a high degree of precision. This is a Westerner talking to the Western media in safe territory. He's not a Russian prisoner of war trying to flatter his captors. Now, before he went to the Donbas region, this all happened in the Donbas, the Eastern Front. He was in Irpin near Kiev, and he was also with Wali, and he was assisting him with ammunition. And in Irpin, they actually ended up running from the Russians. They were just completely overwhelmed by the amount of firepower brought down on them. It was tanks. I do believe he said also rifle fire. And then the CBC was asking him, you know, like, what do you think about Canada's response to all of this? And he said, and the West in general, and he says he's equally skeptical of the West's approach going forward. What Ukraine needs, he said, are boots on the ground. And this shows you how utterly disconnected from reality these guys are. He completely misunderstood, underestimated, had no idea about the situation in Ukraine before he went, and he was shocked into reality to the point where he left the fighting. He won't do it anymore. And even at this point where he has been faced with the consequences of his ignorance, he's still going to keep talking instead of just stopping and admitting he knows nothing and he needs to go back to zero and build an understanding of this conflict. And this goes for Wali also. I'll get into that in just a minute, but just think about if NATO puts boots on the ground in Ukraine, what happens then? I mean, did this guy think that through? No, he doesn't think anything through. That's why he was dodging tank shells in Donbas with absolutely no chance of winning. As a matter of fact, let's talk about Wali here real quick. I'm jumping out of order here, but there's this article here. This is another article about Wali. Wali's third war, the Canadian sniper who could not say no to Ukraine. And it says right here, Wali says that he did not have in-depth knowledge about the conflict, but felt that action was necessary. Not everything is black and white, but what we saw was a large-scale aggression, he said. He does not have in-depth knowledge of the conflict. He admits that. And yet he's going to go there armed, potentially kill people. It turns out he killed no one, but potentially to kill people in a conflict that you have no in-depth knowledge of. Does that sound like a smart thing to do or the right thing to do? No. But this is what Western media turns people into. The people who are receptive to it and the people who don't question it. This is what ends up happening. They become a danger to themselves and others. Now, Wali was part of this Norman Brigade. And we saw in that first CBC article, at that time it was called Norman Group. But then it turned into a brigade, which is funny. I mean, there's only 30 guys and it should be called Norman Platoon at best. But it says, this is the National Post. It says, Incompetence or the Realities of War, Turmoil for Canadian-led foreign battalion in Ukraine. And the links to all of these very interesting articles will be in the video description below. So this Norman Brigade is led by a Canadian. He's living in Ukraine. He has a family. His wife is Ukrainian. He has kids. And he decided to do, I guess, the Norman Group first, which was supposed to be a charity. And then he started getting into the military side of things. To build up his brigade, he's recruiting, you know, mostly Canadians, but also other Westerners to join him. And he's kind of siphoning them off from what I guess would normally go into whatever Ukraine's official foreign legion is. And when they get there, they're in like drafty basements and everyone is getting sick. They said there's 30 guys, but they have weapons for only 7 or 8 of them. They've got, what is it, 30 to 60 bullets per person. And as I've explained before, a full loadout, at least for like a US soldier or a Marine, is 210 rounds. And that'll barely get you through a firefight, if even. Sometimes not even. And so these guys had only 30 to 60 bullets per person. This puts you in danger because you think you're armed and you go into a firefight and you have not nearly enough equipment to sustain yourself in even a basic firefight. And so the whole reason for this article is that many former members of this brigade are complaining about how incompetent the leader is, how poorly equipped it was. So they interview Wali, who was a member of this brigade at one point, and he says, the Norman Brigade was equipped the same way as many Ukrainian units, the sniper said. That means that many things Westerners take for granted are not available. That includes protective equipment, medical supplies, weapons, ammunition. This is what I've been saying every single update about Ukraine, that they're out of weapons, they're out of bullets. The West cannot send it fast enough. Ukraine doesn't have factories that make it. It's not going to happen. It's not something that you can make up for in a couple of months or even a year. This will take a very long time to do this. There's also another interesting thing. We always keep hearing about how Nazis in Ukraine is imagined by Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. But as a matter of fact, the National Post, in its article, it says at one point they discovered that Hroff, the guy leading the Norman Brigade, had a tattoo on his hand of a black sun, a symbol used by the SS in Nazi Germany and sometimes by the neo-fascist movement. Paul and John recall two people that this article was interviewing. My friend James, who was there, literally spat on the ground in front of him and said, this is everything our grandfathers fought against in the Second World War. Do these people realize that the Azov battalion literally operates under a Nazi flag? I wonder if they know that and if they would spit in front of the Azov battalion, who are trapped in Mariupol, but also have factions operating all across the country. So I just thought this article was interesting. It also illustrates the infighting within the group and also fighting between them and other factions over the limited resources that Ukraine has. And again, this is very similar to the situation in Syria, where you had all these armed groups fighting. It was not a single military that they could stand up, just because the nature of what it was they were trying to do. They could not stand up an entire unified army. They could only stand up all of these different groups. They had different ideologies. They were all competing for resources. They were just as likely to kill each other as they were to go fight the Syrian Arab army and their allies. And this is happening in Ukraine right now, where you have these factions fighting with each other while also trying to fight with the Russians. And the Russians are mainly a cohesive standing army. And the grand finale. This is Le Presse. This is French language Canadian media. I suppose it's actually quite large. You can translate this through your browser or through the translation tool of your choice, and read through it. It's very interesting, and it kind of follows the same theme. So in this Le Presse interview with Wali, upon returning to Canada, he recounts the death of those two Ukrainians that I was just talking about in the interview with Shadow. While they were attempting, or I should say failing, to hunt Russian tanks. He returned to Canada after that experience in the Donbas region. He had, at the very beginning, joined that Norman Brigade that I was just talking about, and he notes the lack of weapons and equipment. And he left the Norman Brigade to join Ukraine's official Foreign Legion, but even there, he couldn't find weapons, he couldn't find ammunition, he couldn't even find food. And I don't know if you saw that picture. Let's see if I can find it. He's talking about how they couldn't find food. There's him with the javelin. And they end up actually eating Russian rations that they found because they can't produce their own food. They cannot source their own food. And throughout the interview, you get the impression that he was incredibly frustrated the entire time. He says he didn't kill a single Russian. He shot out a window twice, I think, to scare a potential enemy, and that was it. And he said it's essentially a war of machines. It's a war of machines, and by that he means like the tank that killed those two Ukrainians practically right in front of him. Tanks, artillery, air power. Things that Russia has in abundance, things that Ukraine has ran out of or doesn't have at all. And that's what's actually going on in Ukraine. This is what I talk about in my updates. When I'm reading a Pentagon briefing, this is what the Pentagon is admitting although not in as so many words, because they don't want to admit it, because there's a propaganda element there at play. You have to think, Russia has more machines, they have better machines, they have a larger and better trained force using those machines. What the Russian military has right now on the battlefield is not the total summation of Russian military power. What Ukraine had at the beginning of this conflict, which this part started in February 24th, that was after 8 years of US NATO training, and it is being dismembered right now. And there's absolutely no way they could even rebuild that, let alone create a larger force that could possibly stop just what Russia has on the battlefield right now, not what they could put on the battlefield if they did a full mobilization, which they have not done yet. So again, the truth behind Wali is actually much more damning than any story you can make up or rumor you could spread about him. The fact that he went there, he didn't even really know why he was there. He couldn't find weapons, he couldn't find ammunition, he couldn't find food. The only people that got killed because this super soldier was in Ukraine were the people around him while they were trying and failing to hunt tanks in the Donbas region, or having firefights and being outgunned in Irpin outside of Kiev. You know, this is Westerners who went to Ukraine telling you these facts that I tell you in my regular updates about the crisis in Ukraine. This is Westerners themselves telling you this. It's them telling you that Russia is very competent on the battlefield, overwhelmingly so. It's them telling you that they don't have enough weapons to fight the Russians, and that what weapons they are getting from the West are making no difference. Like the Javelin, they're trying to get in range of a tank with the Javelin. It has like a 2 to 2.5 kilometer range. They're trying to get it that close, just that close to a tank to shoot. And they can't, because the tank can shoot them first. And that is the definition of futility. You know, the people out there that are going to say that I'm doing Russian propaganda, listen to Wali, listen to Shadow. Go read the story about the Norman Brigade. Go read it for yourself. And then you come back and tell me, do you think that Ukraine is winning this or not? Do you honestly think this is this is the West fighting a righteous battle or a proxy war, and that they're bleeding Ukraine down to the last drop of blood, if they can, if they're allowed to? Tell me which one you think it is. I think it's the latter. I don't think that the West is fighting a righteous war. And, you know, just spot the pattern. The US lied about Afghanistan. They were there for 20 years. They lost. They lied about Iraq in 2003. They got 1 million people killed, including thousands of Western troops. And they ultimately failed. They're still in Iraq, but for what? They're also still in Syria. For what? And they triggered and continue to perpetuate the war in Yemen, the worst humanitarian crisis on earth, according to the UN. Do you think that the war in Ukraine is the first righteous war the West, just out of the blue, decided to fight? Or do you think there's a little bit more to the story? Maybe you're like Wali, and you don't have an in-depth understanding of it because you're listening to the Western media instead of thinking for yourself. I don't tell you to go read Russian media. I tell you, think for yourself. Listen to their own words, their experiences coming back from Ukraine. And you tell me yourself if it adds up to Ukraine winning, or the West fighting a righteous war, or the West using Ukraine to bleed out Russia. You tell me. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. And if you're watching this on YouTube, check the video description below for other places you can find my work, like Odyssey, Rumble, and Telegram, just in case YouTube deletes my channel. In the video description below are also all of the links that I just went over. All of these articles are there, so you could read them in their entirety. There's also a video interview with Shadow. It's in English. There's also ways in the video description below that you can help support my work. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and also through PayPal. That is what enables me to continue doing this work on a regular basis. To everyone who has been helping, whether it's a one-time donation, month to month, but also if you're helping share my work with others, or sending news tips, or sending kind words, I appreciate all of that. All of that support is welcomed. And as always, thank you for watching.